The French Revolution was a very important time in history. It started in the year 1789 and lasted for about 10 years. This was not just a small fight, it was a huge event that changed an entire country. Before the revolution, France was ruled by a king who had all the power. The people of France, especially the poor, were not happy with this system. They wanted more rights and a fairer way of life. The revolution was their way of fighting for a new beginning. It was a period filled with big ideas, big battles, and big changes that would shape the future of France and the world. This period was incredibly complex and full of dramatic turns. Imagine a society where your birth decided your entire life. If you were born into a poor family, you would likely stay poor forever. The people grew tired of this unfairness. They saw the rich nobles and the clergy living in luxury while they struggled to buy a single loaf of bread. The revolution was the moment when ordinary people decided they had enough. They stood up to demand a voice in how their country was run. This was a radical idea at the time, and it led to a long and often violent struggle for freedom and equality. The story of the French Revolution is a story about people. It is about bakers, lawyers, soldiers, and housewives who became revolutionaries. They argued in cafes, marched in the streets, and fought on the battlefields for their beliefs. They created new laws, a new calendar, and even tried to create a new kind of society based on reason. Some of their ideas were successful, while others led to terrible violence and fear. Understanding this period helps us understand the birth of modern ideas about democracy, human rights, and the power of the people to change their world. It is a lesson in both the best and worst of what people can do. In this essay, we will explore the journey of the French Revolution. We will look at why it started, walking through the deep-seated problems in French society. We will describe the most important events, from the hopeful first days to the darkest times of the terror. We will meet some of the key people who led and shaped the revolution, for better or for worse. Finally, we will see how the effects of these 10 years spread far beyond the borders of France, leaving a mark on history that we can still see and feel today, more than 2 centuries later. It is a story of hope, struggle, and transformation. One of the biggest reasons the French Revolution started was money. The French government was deeply in debt. It had spent a huge amount of money fighting wars, including helping the Americans in their own revolution against the British. To make matters worse, the king, Louis XVI, and his queen, Marie Antoinette, lived a very expensive life at the Grand Palace of Versailles. While the royal court enjoyed lavish parties and wore costly clothes, the country's treasury was becoming empty. The king's ministers tried to fix the problem, but their solutions often involved asking the poor for more money, which was a recipe for disaster. Another major cause was the price of bread. For ordinary French people, bread was the most important food. It was the main part of almost every meal. In the years leading up to 1789, the harvests were very bad. This meant there was not enough wheat to make flour, and the price of bread shot up. A worker might have to spend almost all of their daily wages just to buy one loaf for their family. People were hungry, and their hunger turned into anger. They saw the nobility and the clergy living well, seemingly unconcerned with their suffering. This created a deep sense of injustice that fueled the desire for change. New ideas also played a crucial role in starting the revolution. During a period called the Enlightenment, thinkers and writers like Rousseau and Voltaire began to question old traditions. They wrote about liberty, equality, and the rights of citizens. They argued that governments should serve the people, not the other way around. These ideas spread through pamphlets, newspapers, and conversations in cafes across Paris and other cities. People started to believe that they deserved a better government and a fairer society. They were no longer willing to quietly accept the absolute power of the king and the privileges of the rich. Finally, the social structure of France was incredibly unfair. Society was divided into 3 groups known as the 3 estates. The first 2 estates, the clergy and the nobility, had all the privileges. They owned most of the land, paid almost no taxes, and held the most powerful jobs. The third estate, which was everyone else, made up over 97% of the population. This group included poor farmers, city workers, and even wealthy businessmen. They had to pay all the taxes but had no say in how the country was run. This deep inequality created a lot of resentment and was a powder keg waiting to explode. In the France of the 1780s, everyone belonged to one of 3 social classes, or estates. The first estate was the clergy, which included everyone from powerful bishops and cardinals to simple village priests. The church was incredibly wealthy and powerful. It owned about 10% of all the land in France and collected a tax called the tithe from farmers. The higher-ranking members of the clergy, often from noble families, lived lives of great luxury. The First Estate was a very small group making up less than 1% of the population, yet they held enormous influence and were exempt from paying most taxes to the king, which created a lot of anger among the common people. The Second Estate was the nobility. This group was made up of the royal family, dukes, counts, and other aristocrats who had inherited their titles and wealth. Like the clergy, they were a tiny fraction of the population, perhaps around 400,000 people in total. They owned a huge portion of the land, about 25%, and held the most important positions in the army, the government, and the king's court. A key privilege of the nobility was that they paid very few taxes. In fact, they were proud of this exemption, seeing it as a sign of their superior status. Their lavish lifestyle stood in stark contrast to the poverty of the masses. The Third Estate was everybody else. This was by far the largest group, representing more than 27 million people, or about 97% of the entire country. However, the Third Estate was not one single group, it was very diverse. At the top were the bourgeoisie, merchants, lawyers, doctors, and manufacturers who had become wealthy through their work. Below them were the urban workers of the cities, known as the sans-culottes, who worked as artisans and laborers. The largest part of the Third Estate was the peasantry, the millions of farmers who worked the land. Despite their vast numbers and diversity, they were all united by what they lacked: privilege and power. The burden of running the country fell almost entirely on the shoulders of the Third Estate. They were the ones who paid the heavy royal taxes, the tithes to the church, and feudal dues to their local lords. A farmer might have to give away more than half of what he produced each year. The wealthy bourgeoisie, despite having money, were frustrated because they were excluded from the highest positions of power, which were reserved for the nobility. This unfair system, where the vast majority of people supported the privileged few, was one of the deepest and most explosive problems facing France on the eve of the Revolution. In 1789, King Louis XVI was facing a financial crisis. He decided to call a meeting of the Estates General, an assembly with representatives from all three estates. This was the first time it had been called in 175 years. The representatives of the Third Estate arrived in Versailles with high hopes. They brought with them lists of grievances, called the detailing the problems they wanted to fix. However, they quickly became frustrated. The old rules said that each estate voted as a bloc, meaning the First and Second Estates could always outvote the Third. The Third Estate demanded a fairer system where every representative had one vote, but the king and the privileged orders refused. Feeling ignored and sidelined, the representatives of the Third Estate took a bold step. On June 20th, 1789, they gathered at a nearby indoor tennis court after finding their usual meeting hall locked. There, they swore a famous oath known as the Tennis Court Oath. They promised not to give up or go home until they had written a new constitution for France. This was a direct challenge to the king's authority. By declaring themselves a national assembly, they were saying that the true power of the nation rested with the people, not with the monarch. This act of defiance was a turning point, marking the real beginning of the revolution. Meanwhile, tensions were rising in Paris. The people were afraid that the king was going to use his army to crush the new National Assembly. On July 14th, 1789, an angry crowd decided to arm themselves. They marched to the Bastille, a medieval fortress in the heart of Paris that was used as a prison. For the people, the Bastille was a powerful symbol of the king's oppressive rule. After a bloody battle, the crowd stormed the fortress, freed the few prisoners inside, and took the weapons stored there. The fall of the Bastille was a huge symbolic victory. It showed that the people were no longer afraid, and that the king was losing control of his kingdom. Following these events, the National Assembly began to make sweeping changes. In August 1789, they issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This groundbreaking document was inspired by Enlightenment ideals and the American Declaration of Independence. It declared that all men were born free and equal in rights. It proclaimed rights to liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It stated that the law should be the same for everyone, and that all citizens had a right to participate in government. This declaration laid the foundation for a new, more democratic society, and became one of the most important documents in human history. After the initial hopeful phase of the revolution, things took a much darker turn. France was at war with other European countries like Austria and Prussia who, feared the revolution would spread. The king, Louis XVI, was suspected of trying to help France's enemies. In 1792, the monarchy was abolished and France was declared a republic. The following year, the former king was put on trial for treason and executed by the guillotine, a new machine designed for swift and supposedly humane executions. This event shocked Europe and honestly deepened the divisions within France itself. The revolution was entering its most radical and violent stage. This period, from 1793 to 1794, became known as the Reign of Terror. The government was controlled by a small group of determined men called the Committee of Public Safety, led by a lawyer named Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre and his followers believed that, to save the revolution, they had to destroy all of its enemies, both inside and outside of France. They created special courts to try anyone suspected of being a counter-revolutionary. The definition of an enemy was, very broad. You could be arrested for complaining about the price of bread, for being a noble, or simply for not seeming enthusiastic enough about the revolution. During the Reign of Terror, a climate of extreme fear and suspicion gripped the country. Neighbors spied on neighbors, and a careless word could lead to an accusation. Around 17,000 people were officially executed by the guillotine, and many thousands more died in prison or were killed in massacres across the country. The guillotine became the grim symbol of this era, with daily public executions in the squares of Paris and other cities. Famous figures like Queen Marie Antoinette were executed, but the vast majority of victims were ordinary people from the Third Estate, the very people the revolution was supposed to help. The terror eventually consumed its own creators. Robespierre, who had become the most powerful man in France, started to see enemies everywhere. Other revolutionary leaders began to fear that they would be his next victims. In July 1794, a group of his opponents in the government organized against him. They had him arrested and, without a proper trial, sent him to the same guillotine where he had sent so many others. The death of Robespierre marked the end of the Reign of Terror. The violence slowly subsided, but the period left deep scars on France and a terrifying legacy of how revolutionary ideals can be, twisted into tyranny. After the end of the Reign of Terror, France was still in a state of chaos. The government that followed, known as the Directory, was weak, corrupt, and unpopular. It really struggled to solve the country's continuing problems of war and economic instability. The French people were just tired of the constant political fighting and longed for peace and order. It was during this uncertain time that a young and brilliant military general began to rise to fame. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was born on the island of Corsica and had already proven himself to be a masterful leader on the battlefields of Italy and Egypt, winning stunning victories for France. Napoleon was not only a skilled general, but also a very ambitious man. He saw the weakness of the Directory as an opportunity. In 1799, he returned to Paris as a national hero. Working with a few politicians who wanted a stronger government, he organized a coup d'etat, which, in simple terms, is a swift and forceful seizure of power. On November 9, 1799, his soldiers surrounded the government's legislature and forced the leaders to hand over power to him. He established a new form of government called the consulate, with himself as the first consul. But in reality, he held all the power. The French Revolution was over, and the age of Napoleon had begun. As the leader of France, Napoleon brought many of the revolution's changes into a more permanent form. He created a single, clear set of laws for the entire country, known as the Napoleonic Code. This code confirmed the abolition of feudal privileges and established the equality of all male citizens before the law, religious freedom, and the protection of private property. It was a huge step in modernizing France's legal system and was so successful that it was adopted or copied by many other countries around the world. He also reformed the government, the banking system, and the education system, creating a more efficient and centralized state. However, Napoleon's ambition did not stop at France's borders. He was a military genius who believed it was his destiny to control Europe. In 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of the French, completely ending the idea of a republic. For the next decade, he waged a series of wars, known as the Napoleonic Wars, across the continent. He conquered vast territories and placed his relatives on the thrones of other nations. While he spread some revolutionary ideas like the Napoleonic Code, his constant wars caused immense destruction and the deaths of millions. His reign ended with his final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. The French Revolution completely transformed the way France was governed and structured. Before 1789, France was an absolute monarchy, where the king held all the power by divine right. After the revolution, even though the monarchy was eventually restored for a time, it was never the same. The idea that the people were the source of power, not the king, had really taken root. This principle of popular sovereignty led to the creation of written constitutions and representative assemblies. The complex and overlapping old regions of France were replaced by 83 new uniform administrative areas called départements, a system that still exists today and made the country much easier to govern. One of the most significant changes was the end of the old social structure based on privilege. The revolution dismantled the three estates. The special rights of the nobility and the clergy were abolished forever. The principle of equality before the law was established, meaning that everyone, regardless of their birth, was subject to the same laws and had to pay taxes. Careers were now said to be open to talent, meaning that people could get important jobs in the government or the army based on their ability, not their family name. This created a more dynamic society and allowed men of talent like Napoleon to rise to the highest levels of power. The revolution also had a profound impact on the role of the church. Before, the Catholic Church was an immensely powerful and wealthy institution, almost a state within a state. The revolutionaries seized the church's vast lands and sold them to raise money for the government. They also passed a law that put the church under the control of the state, requiring priests to be elected and to swear an oath of loyalty to the nation. While Napoleon later made peace with the Pope, the church never regained the kind of political power and wealth it had held before 1789. The idea of religious toleration also became more widely accepted. For ordinary people, daily life changed in many ways, both big and small. A new standardized system of weights and measures, the metric system, was introduced, making trade and commerce simpler and fairer. A new sense of national identity emerged. People began to see themselves not as subjects of a king, but as citizens of the French nation, the patrie. They flew the tricolor flag and sang the new national anthem, La Marseillaise. While the revolution did not solve all of France's problems and certainly did not bring equality to women, it set in motion a profound transformation that created the foundations of modern France. The French Revolution was not an event that was contained within the borders of France. Its ideas and armies spread across Europe and the world like shockwaves. The revolutionary slogan of liberty, equality, fraternity inspired people in other countries who were living under oppressive monarchies. In places like Italy, Germany, and Poland, intellectuals and radicals formed clubs and societies to discuss these new ideas. They dreamed of bringing similar revolutions to their own nations. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was translated into many languages and became a model for those fighting for political freedom and human rights everywhere. The wars of the Revolution and Napoleon carried these changes by force. As French armies marched across Europe, they brought the Napoleonic Code with them. They abolished feudalism and serfdom in the lands they conquered, and they reorganized governments along French lines. While many people resented French domination, the experience of these reforms was powerful. It gave people a taste of a more modern and equal society, and it was difficult for the old kings and princes to completely undo these changes after Napoleon was defeated. The wars also fueled the rise of nationalism, as people in Spain, Russia, and the German states fought back against French invaders, forging stronger national identities in the process. The revolution's influence reached far beyond Europe. In the Caribbean, the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which is now modern-day Haiti, was deeply affected. The ideals of liberty and equality inspired the enslaved population to rise up against their masters in 1791. This led to a long and brutal struggle, led by remarkable figures like Toussaint Louverture. The Haitian Revolution was the only successful slave revolt in modern history, and it resulted in the creation of Haiti as an independent nation in 1804. It was a powerful and direct consequence of the French Revolution's promise of freedom, even if the French leaders themselves were often reluctant to grant it to their colonies. In Latin America, the events in France also had a huge impact. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808 and put his brother on the Spanish throne, it created a power vacuum in Spain's vast American empire. Colonists in places like Venezuela, Argentina, and Mexico saw their chance to fight for independence. Leaders like Simon Bolivar and José de San Martin were deeply influenced by Enlightenment and revolutionary ideas. They led independence movements that, over the next 2 decades, would free most of Latin America from European rule. The French Revolution provided both the inspiration and the opportunity for these world-changing events. More than 2 centuries after the storming of the Bastille, the French Revolution continues to hold a powerful place in our world. Its most enduring legacy is the set of political ideas it unleashed. Concepts like democracy, citizenship, and human rights, which were once radical, are now central to how many people believe societies should be organized. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen provided a blueprint for countless other constitutions and international declarations, including the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When people today protest for freedom or demand a say in their government, they are following in the footsteps of the French revolutionaries. The revolution also shaped the modern political landscape by giving us the terms left and right. During the First National Assembly, the more radical deputies who wanted sweeping changes happened to sit on the left side of the hall, while the more conservative deputies who wanted to preserve the monarchy sat on the right. This simple seating arrangement gave us the political vocabulary we still use today to describe different political ideologies. The revolution showed that politics was not just for kings and aristocrats. It was something that involved all citizens who could organize and fight for their competing visions of a better society. Of course, the revolution also serves as a powerful warning. The slide from the hopeful ideals of 1789 to the brutal violence of the Reign of Terror shows how easily the pursuit of a perfect society can lead to tyranny and bloodshed. It reminds us that liberty can be fragile and that the rights of individuals must be protected, even during times of crisis. The story of Robespierre is a timeless lesson about how a leader who claims to speak for the people can end up silencing all dissent and becoming a dictator. This dark side of the revolution is just as important to remember as its inspiring achievements. Ultimately, the French Revolution remains important because it was a defining moment in the long struggle for human freedom. It asserted that ordinary people could fundamentally change their world. It overthrew a centuries-old monarchy and a deeply entrenched social order, replacing them with a vision of a nation based on liberty and equality for its citizens. Although the revolution was messy, violent, and full of contradictions, it permanently changed our understanding of what a government should be and what a people can achieve. Its story continues to inspire and caution us as we navigate the challenges of our own time.